Hello, I'm Lynda Gratton, Professor of Management Practice at the London Business School, and I'd love to tell you about the future of work. In fact, I'm going to give you 4 lessons to think about the future of work. May I have my first slide, please? My first lesson is this: keep in mind the long-term trends that are changing the nature of work. Now, I know that at the moment, everybody's talking about any specific trend. So if it's Japan, they're talking about demography. If it's San Francisco, they're talking about technology, and we're all talking about hybrid and pandemic. But actually, I've been studying the future of work for more than 30 years. And these are the 3 trends that I look at. So my first lesson is, I think that you should also be looking at these trends and just keep an eye on them. Here are the 3 that I find most fascinating. Number 1, the fact that people are living longer. I wrote a book, The 100-Year Life, which really explored what happens when everybody works to 100, lives to 100. Well, the first thing that happens is that we work into our 70s. Yes. The second trend I look at is technology, and I look at it from 3 perspectives. The first is, what impact is technology going to have on jobs? What we know is those initial ideas that technology would destroy jobs has not turned out to be the case. In fact, what we've learned is technology changes jobs. In fact, most of us, 60% of the tasks that we do are going to be automated, AI, robotics. So we need to keep an eye on that. But also, secondly, the new sort of jobs that are being created, jobs, for example, in the digital space. The third trend that I look at is particularly about society. I look at families and I look at communities. Families, for example, isn't it fascinating that in so many families now, 2 people work, even though for many older organizations, they were designed at a time when only the man worked and the mum was staying at home, having a job, and then perhaps only later a career. So these trends are important however we think about the future of work and whatever's happening right now. My second lesson is really to think what it means from the individual. What do you want from your future of work? And I want to suggest there's 2 things that we've learned about what we want from our future of work. The first is, imagine you're somebody who's going to live to 100 at a time of intense technological change. What do you want? You might actually be that person. Well, the old idea of a life course, which is full-time education, full-time work, and full-time retirement, is obviously not going to work for you. What you want is something much more multi-stage, where if you're going to work into your 70s and have to upskill and reskill all the time, you need something much more flexible, much more based around your needs in terms of maybe starting your own business or taking a sabbatical or building a portfolio and so on. In other words, you need a great deal more autonomy over the way that you work. But there's one other thing that you want in terms of work. When we started to think about what the deal was in terms of work, we thought about it primarily in terms of tangible assets. How much money you get paid, how much you're able to save, therefore buy stuff with that, and the pension that you get. Now, I'm not suggesting that tangible assets don't remain important. They certainly do. It's really important that we get a decent wage. But what's much more important as you think about the future of work is intangible assets, those things that money can't buy. Things like, for example, how do I stay productive? How do I develop my brand? And how do I learn new skills? That means at whatever age, I'm always going to be able to get a job. How do I have vitality? Vitality, both in terms of, my own health. And we remember it takes quite a lot of time to stay healthy, but also in terms of my friendships and my networks. And thirdly, the intangible asset of being able to transform yourself, to be able to change yourself. So where are we? Well, lesson 1, you've really got to think about all the trends that are shaping work. Lesson 2, look at it from the individual perspective. Lesson 3, think about it from the aspect of work. Now, we all do different jobs, but if you think about your job, there's probably a number of key elements to it. Some of you might do jobs like me, which are very much based on focus. I'm basically a writer. And so for me, being on my own, undisturbed, is really important for my productivity. Many of you have jobs that are around coordination. You don't have to be in the same room as the other person, but you certainly have to use coordination mechanisms. And the third tasks that some of you have is where you need to cooperate. And the question about the future of work is, how do you really make those work in terms of the future? What's going to be the impact of technology? But also, as we move out of the pandemic into a hybrid way of working, what's going to suit those hybrid ways of working? For example, if you do a focus job like me, do you need to be in the office? But if you coordinated, perhaps you do. And if you cooperate, the office becomes important as a place where you can meet. But how do you then make the very most of it? So actually thinking about the job is really important. But it's also thinking about the networks, because if you think about the future of work, it's also about the future of networks. How are you going to make those relationships that are really going to make a difference to your productivity and indeed to your capacity to stay flexible right the way through your career? And what we know from networks is that there are three types of networks that are really important. Some of them are really networks, and you can see here on this diagram, where you are tightly related to people who are very similar to you, like me at London Business School with the other academics that surround me. We exploit the knowledge that we already have. We talk to each other. We learn a great deal from each other. But actually, if you want to have new ideas, you have to have networks also with other people who are entirely different from yourself. For example, my book, The 100-Year Life, I think was successful in part because I, as a psychologist, wrote with another person who was an economist. We actually synthesized psychological research with economic research to really talk about what happens when everyone lives to 100. But there's another type of network that's really important, which is where you just bump into people, have those novel combinations. And it's really interesting that right now, as we move out of the pandemic, people are talking a lot about these network structures, both now and in the future. And the sort of questions they're asking is, well, how do I stay relevant? But also, how do I have a sense of belonging? You know, how do I have friendships at work? And how do I make sure that I bump into people who are going to inspire me and really help me to be very creative? So these are really important issues that we face as we think about the future of work. And I want to finish with my lesson number 4, which is don't underestimate the impact of the pandemic. I've been a professor at the London Business School for more than 30 years. And I can say without a doubt that those 2 years that we spent in lockdown, I spent in lockdown and you spent in lockdown, made an enormous impression on us. We certainly accelerated our digital skills. For example, at London Business School, we learned how to do this sort of training, which we'd never have done before. But we also began to question who we are and what we are, and go back to those individual issues that I spoke of at the beginning, which was really about, how do you want your life to be? And as we think about the impact of the pandemic, of course, we're also realizing that the pandemic taught us how to work from home. So if you think about a 2x2 here, which is to say place is constrained, you have to be in the office all the time, to unconstrained, you can work anywhere you were. Then we're moving along the unconstrained. People now have more autonomy about where they work. But actually, I also want to invite you to think about time, to realize that there's a whole load of people out there who have no capacity to change where they work. My son, for example, was a a doctor on accident and emergency right the way through the pandemic. He couldn't decide to work from home. He had to be in the hospital every day. Same for so many factory workers and people working in security and delivery. What can we do for them to make sure that trust doesn't break down? And here I think we can also think about flexibility around time when people work as well as where they work. So I hope that you've found those 4 lessons useful. And what I'd like to do now is to turn back to our hosts at Rotman.